thank you all. I guess you figured out we're starting. Most importantly, before I begin, I really do want to thank all of you. I know that despite the large numbers that have come, actually London lawyers have a lot to do these days, and I appreciate, we at Wilmer Cutler appreciate very much your spending the time with us. I know that some of you have come from very far. Some of you have come from Brazil and passed up Carnival for coming to this, and I think that speaks for how interesting the topic is. Thank you also to Professor Rogers, who is the reason that we're here. Catherine Rogers is the founder and the guiding inspiration behind arbitrator intelligence, and this evening she will introduce the prototype for arbitrator intelligence. An old partner at Wilmer was telling me the other day about what it used to be like to practice law. And he told me about using a typewriter and using a telex machine and a fax machine. And he compared that to today's world of the internet. Someday you'll be telling stories like that to younger lawyers. You'll be telling stories about how you used to use the telephone and email to do research on the most important task in international arbitration, namely choosing an arbitrator. And that younger lawyer, just the way I did today, will roll their eyes and say, my goodness, how did you ever get along without arbitrator intelligence? With no further attempts at humor, Professor Rogers, who will tell you about the prototype for arbitrator intelligence. Thank you.
Well, thank you also for me for coming out on a Monday evening, and for giving me some of your time to talk about a project that I've been working on now for about 13 years. I first wrote a law review article looking at the market for arbitrator services about 13 years ago. And in that article, I identified the fact that this is a very opaque market, characterized by profound information asymmetries. It's also a market with high barriers to entry. And the combination of these things makes it very difficult to select an arbitrator. To be sure, when you're selecting an arbitrator, the arbitrator you are appointing is one that's well suited to your case strategy, to your client's case strategy. And it was out of that article, over many, many years, I've developed the model that I'm going to present to you tonight, arbitrator intelligence. But first, because we're here at WilmerHale, and Gary, I think, has just now left, unfortunately, because the theme for tonight's presentation is one we've all seen Gary's presentation on Game of Thrones. So I picked the Game of Thrones theme for the evening. And I wanted to start with imagining or characterizing what dispute resolution is like in the Seven Kingdoms in the Game of Thrones. Okay, for those of you who don't know, the Seven Kingdoms make up Westeros. Okay, and it doesn't really tell you in the series what year it takes place, but you can imagine it is supposed to be quite an antiquated world. And so the technology they have to try and resolve their seemingly constant disputes between their kingdoms is really quite crude. You have the sword, you have the arrow, you have, relatively sophisticated by comparison, the catapult, and then you have the horse, which makes it much more difficult, for example, to use the sword. He doesn't look like he's going to fare very well there. Okay? But one of the things that happens, kind of central to the whole plot of Game of Thrones, is that they introduce some radical new technology. And that new technology is really game-changing in terms of how battles are fought in the Game of Thrones. And that technology, if you haven't paid attention to this series, just maybe I'm pointing in the wrong place, is the dragon. They bring back the previously extinct dragon, and it changes the entire way that battles are fought, because if you have a nice big dragon, that can just blow fire on everyone. You have a distinct advantage in the battles. So now let's go to our world, international arbitration, and say, how is it that international arbitration technology is used to help us in resolving our disputes? And particularly, how is it used to identify international arbitrators? Well, as Gary sort of previewed, you might send out an email, and you send it to your large network, everyone you can possibly think of, and you ask, have you, from your kind of short list, has anyone appeared before this arbitrator recently? Or has anyone, even better yet, sat as a co-arbitrator with this arbitrator? Now, why is it that we use that system that I will call game of phones? Okay? The reason is because international arbitration is, one of its most important features, confidential. The awards are essentially secret, and the proceedings are not open to the public. So how can you know the track record of an arbitrator unless you find people who've either been before that arbitrator or sat with them? Now, that doesn't maybe sound like a huge deal, except that international arbitrators have a tremendous amount of discretion, we know, as compared to, for example, a national court judge. National court judges are constrained by rules of civil procedure, rules of evidence. They are sort of supervised by appellate review. But in international arbitration, you take all those away, and you effectively replace it with arbitrator discretion. And so when you're trying to search for your arbitrator, your ideal arbitrator for the case, you need to figure out how are they going to manage, how are they going to exercise that discretion? Are they going to do so in a way that is advantageous to the client? And the telephone is largely the way we find that out, because the questions can be relatively sensitive. But I would like to submit that the telephone, the way we currently use, is no match for dragging, sort of smushing it. And the idea is that we need, I think, in international arbitration, a better, more sophisticated way to access information about arbitrators. But we still need to protect that confidentiality. And that's where arbitrator intelligence comes in. What we did is we have come up with, I think, what we might call a hack to this problem of preserving confidentiality while creating access to much more needed information. So the idea is at the end of an arbitration, an award is rendered. What we've created is an online, confidential arbitrator intelligence questionnaire. Now the questionnaire is on our secure platform. I should highlight, the questionnaire does not ask the names of the parties. You have to register as someone to take the questionnaire, because we need to make sure that you're not a bot, or that you're not an arbitrator secretly filling out all sorts of questionnaires to make yourself look really great. Okay? But the registration of individuals who fill out the questionnaire are not, they're treated as anonymous, and they're never connected with the data that's submitted. Okay? So you register online anonymously, you complete a questionnaire that asks a number of important points about the case, but nothing that reveals confidential information about the case. And we've had confirmed by in-house counsel, they don't think that the questionnaire implicates anything confidential. They have said, as a sort of footnote, there might be some cases where they don't want AIQs filled out on a particular case because it's so readily identifiable. But so there might be a little caveat in there, but generally it doesn't ask for any confidential information. It does ask for all sorts of details about the case. And I'll tell you a little bit about the AIQ before I go on. It's divided into two phases. Phase 1 can be filled out by anyone who has access to the case file or the award. It asks for questions like, what was the date it was commenced? What were the names of the arbitrators, quite obviously? What was the amount requested? What was the amount awarded? What was the date of the close of the proceedings? What was the, in addition to what was the amount awarded, was interest requested? If so, was it granted? If it was granted, what standard, what percentage was used? Was it simple or compounded? That's these kinds of objective details based on the award of the court file. At the end of phase 1, which can be filled out by anyone, including a legal secretary or paralegal, you nominate someone to take phase 2. Now phase 2 asks for information that you usually, not always, but usually have to have been participating in the hearings. Okay? And it asks some material, important information like, for example, and we'll look at the data on this later, Was document production requested? If so, was it granted? If it was granted, what standard was used for the granting? Specific individually identified documents or broad categories? Okay. If it was denied, what was the reason for denial? So document production requests and the availability of document production is one of the key issues that people ask about when they're searching for an arbitrator. Another part, because we did research to see what were the most frequently asked questions. The other category of really frequently asked questions is if you have an issue of, and you almost inevitably do, of contract interpretation, statutory interpretation, treaty interpretation. Is this arbitrator, is this someone who's a very strict textualist in interpreting it? Or is it someone who might, for contract interpretation, include some sense of commercial common sense, some consideration of fairness and equity? Okay? And so when you're picking an arbitrator, you have a sense of where they might be inclined to, or at least what the pattern of the history has been with regard to these critical issues. Those issues are identified or requested information on those in phase 2 of the questionnaire. So the questionnaire is administered on our confidential, secure platform. Once we receive that information, it's treated as data. It goes into a big spreadsheet. That data will then be, right now we're in the process of doing it, analyzed and turned into arbitrator intelligence reports. And what I'm going to show you now is a preview of the arbitrator intelligence reports. It's a prototype of what they will be. And the idea is that once these reports are generated, they'll be made available for sale so that when you need to pick an arbitrator, you'll be able to access a report to answer a lot of the questions that to date, the only way you can find them out is by calling around to friends and colleagues. Now the idea, the main difference that we're talking about between telephone calls and the reports is a sort of balance between, or a trade-off between, and it's not a mutually exclusive trade-off by any means, it's a complementary one, between qualitative information, anecdotal information, and analytic data-based analysis. So I don't think you'll ever give up the phone, but the idea is that maybe you would have some more sophisticated information to use in making those phone calls. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Diana Artemis, who is our completely fictitious made-up arbitrator. But we imagine her to be, this is what the front page of the arbitrator intelligence reports will look like. They will eventually be for sale through Cutler on their platform. They're in the process of creating a new arbitrator source. And this is, as we can see here, the dashboard. So we imagined a sort of mid-level arbitrator who's had about 43 cases. This is not only fake data, it's also a little bit irrational data. You can see it doesn't match. We have information about who is sat with whom, so you could access information about with whom this arbitrator is sat, because you might want to make those phone calls. And here's a previewing of some of the data. So for example, and this is still our dashboard page, so this is very general information. You can access information about who prevails in the cases presided over by Artemis. In addition, and again, this is all very preview charts, so we go into detail later, and I'll show you that in a moment. But this one says, look, if you're trying to look at, if you had a bifurcation, for example, this is not full, my video is moving too quickly, but you can look and see kind of how your arbitrator compares to the average. The reports will be interactive, so you can click on pop-up menus that will help you understand how to analyze or understand the data. This is another one, as I was mentioning, we have interpreted methodologies for contracts. Artemis is the dark blue. All arbitrators in the general sample is in purple, and you can see, at least theoretically, and again, this is all hypothesized fake data, but in this we've imagined that most arbitrators tend to focus more on the drafting history, whereas Artemis is much more attached to plain meaning. And again, we have deeper examples on this. So let's do a deeper dive into the report on what does it look like for document production. And I should say, you're welcome to interrupt with questions. I teach, so I don't consider it rude. I actually think it can make it more interesting. Certainly if you see questions coming up on this. So as you can see, we have all these different categories. You might want to know if you desperately need interim relief. Is this an arbitrator that has a track record of granting interim relief or denying it? jurisdiction. We have breaking down of the different categories of jurisdictional objections, whether they're granted or denied. This is on document production. So as I said, there's a series of questions in the questionnaire about document production. There are data is based on what is requested. And here you can see, again, I'm not going over these in too much detail. We will be posting this online so you can go over it in more detail. But here we see comparisons of the percentage of grants, how often is document production granted based on how frequently it's requested. This question has, is translated into the basis for this chart is a question that will be produced in the questionnaire, so you, excuse me, in the report so you can see it, about how frequent or what categories are granted. This one is if you had your document request denied. Would you like to know why denials have been made in the past? And then we do have evaluative questions because sometimes the raw data isn't enough. It can be helpful to have some sort of evaluative analysis based on what the parties or their counsel looked at as the baseline. And whenever we ask an evaluative question, there are a lot of different variables that might affect that answer. So one of the things we do is you can actually, the bottom got cut off on this, you can filter the data that we have based on a number of different variables, based on whether the parties thought they won or lost, what her position was she acting as a sole arbitrator, in which case you know if the document production was granted, it really was her decision personally as opposed to a co-arbitrator where she might not have been able to control it. You can also evaluate based on the experience level of the responder. So we will have a page on the demographics of the responder. So you can say, well, where does all this data come from? And we'll have some analytics so you can see, okay, well, most of the responders were outside counsel. Most of them were based in Europe. There were some in-house counsel. Most of them had actually a great deal of experience, so they were pretty sophisticated. Okay? And you can see one of the areas we ask in the questionnaire is level of experience. How many cases have they participated in? 1 to 5, 6 to 20, 21 to 100, or more than 100. Okay? And you can evaluate how much you trust certain answers based on experience level. So these videos have been going really quickly. Are there any questions so far? You want to hold on to them all? Hold on to them all. Okay. So the next category I'll show you is timing to award. So we know that one of the other major issues right now that is a topic of conversation, certainly with in-house counsel, but with institutions constantly, is the timing of awards. So when we were developing the questionnaire, and I'll pause for just a moment to talk to you about how we did that. So we actually spent probably over a year developing the questionnaire. We first came up with what we thought were just a great set of questions. And then we started essentially shopping it around. We did a bunch of in-house presentations, not unlike this one. And we got tremendous feedback about how we should design the questionnaire. One of my favorite ones actually comes from a Wilmer partner in another office. We wanted to make sure that we could sort the data based on winners or losers to see if it would change, if their evaluations would change, because everyone was concerned, as they should be, with what I call the disgruntled losing party problem, right? You know, you can't appeal an arbitral award. Arbitrators have immunity, so you can't sue them. Maybe you can get your revenge by filling out an AIQ. So let me pause here for a moment and say why that's not going to be a particularly effective means. First of all, as you may have already sensed, depending on some answers, the number of questions grows or shrinks on the AIQ. But roughly, I would say about 80% of the questions that we ask are not evaluative at all. They're just factual. Was document production requested? If so, was it granted? Okay. Some of them have some judgment involved. So for example, if you say, well, what was the type of methodology that was used to interpret the contract? That involves some discretion, okay? But it's not like there's a right answer. Because in one case you want plain meaning, and that's the right answer, that's a good answer. And in some case you want someone who is going to be more flexible, who takes into account business common sense. So most of our questions, the vast majority of questions on the questionnaire are factual and do not have a right or wrong answer. We do ask some evaluative questions, but we ask them in ways that are designed to make them as fair as possible. And we also will be checking rigorously
to see if the answers change or are affected by whether the party won or lost. So I started to say we had a correction from a Wilmer partner in a different office. So we originally asked, so we could filter the data, did you win or lose the arbitration? Self-select. And she said to us, no one is going to self-select a box and check, no lawyer, self-respecting lawyer is going to check a box saying, we lost. Okay? So we changed the nature of the question, and now we ask, was the award more favorable or less favorable than you were expecting, or about what you were expecting? And that's sort of a gentle euphemism for whether you won or lost. And because they're not asking whether they won or lost, we think it's also going to elicit a more accurate or credible answer. We have a number of questions in the questionnaire there that are designed as control questions to double check. One of the other ways that we can verify the quality of our data is when we have multiple people respond about the same arbitration. So let's say we had opposing counsel and we had inside and outside counsel on the same case. So we don't know who the parties are, so we can't identify it by case name, but if it has the same date, the same arbitrators, and the same amount or outcome in the final decision, we know that that's the same arbitration. And then we can match the answers. And if opposing counsel on the same side for questions that had some judgment involved answer the same, we will eventually be able to weight the answer and say we have great confidence in these answers. And if they end up different, it shows up a red flag, and we can qualify the data and say, you might want to take this one with a grain of salt because there was some difference of opinion in the outcome. One of the areas, though, that is purely factual, actually I'll say it's factual with a caveat, is the timing of awards. So here's what our projected,
Yeah.
oh, let's see if we have that. All right, so the idea is, the other thing that's valuable about this kind of analysis is sometimes parties can have unrealistic expectations about how quickly an award should be rendered. It should be 3 months after the close of the proceedings. Well, that would be nice. They would like that to happen, but it's not particularly. They can't assume that that's what everyone does. So it's really nice to have an average. So one of the things we will determine, and likely parties will be able to choose what they want as their baseline for comparison. So for example, do you want all arbitrators, or do you think you only want arbitrators in cases over $50 million in the oil and gas industry? We can sort for those. What you see here also is, again, it'll be a sort of interactive report, so you can kind of teach yourself how to understand it as you're using it. Something as simple as value. What we are using is we'll be using US dollars, but the rate will be converted based on the exchange rate on the date that the award was rendered. Okay? So that they have to be in the same currency to be comparable, but we need to do that conversion. So on this chart, we thought it was interesting to look at, okay, well, what's the timing, what's this person's performance and timing when they're the sole arbitrator, the chair, or the co-arbitrator? And we've imagined this is, again, a very responsible arbitrator who in a few cases has been taken longer than the average, but most of the time comes in underneath. And certainly when she's sitting by herself, she's far outperforms the average time. We do in the questionnaire ask, even if it's not always possible to answer, is there any reason that the parties or the counsel might know for delay in the award? Because we heard when we were preparing the questionnaire, a lot of arbitrators said, there can be some antics by the counsel, there can be an illness by an arbitrator, there can be a number of things that delay the award that are beyond the control of the arbitrators. And sometimes those are known to parties and counsel and sometimes they aren't, which is why when I do presentations like this, the number one question I get is, can arbitrators fill out the questionnaire? And it's usually some arbitrators, because there was this guy, and he took so long to do his dissent, so it ruined the whole timing of it. Unfortunately, no, arbitrators cannot fill this out. The questionnaire is available for parties and counsel. Let's imagine even third-party funders, if they participate actively, might fill it out. But arbitrators cannot fill it out because they have special duties of confidentiality based on the deliberations of the tribunal. And explaining that one particular arbitrator delayed everything would be effectively disclosing deliberations of the tribunal. In addition, we think that the managers at arbitral institutions have similar obligations of confidentiality, and so they cannot fill it out. But that does leave parties at counsel to complete the questionnaire. With regard to timing in particular, for some parties this is incredibly important. For other parties it's less so. So let me look at where we're going now. So I do think one of the trends that's being cited by various sources, law firms, and certainly academics, is the trend towards data in all sorts of legal contexts. So these are, I picked up judicial analytics, which all over the world, I'm not sure where I'm supposed to be pointing this. Okay, so this is working maybe better than this. The judicial analytics, particularly in the United States, but also in Europe, are kind of incredible how many sources are available and how detailed they are. Now this is, so when you in the United States, there's a company in particular this chart comes from, and one of the others called Ravel Law. And let's say you have a motion to dismiss before some district court judge in California, and you want to know, I mean, you don't get to choose that judge. That judge is assigned to you. Okay? But judicial analytics are incredibly popular, and lawyers swear they will not go to court without doing this first. Why? Because you want to know if this judge in patent cases has like a 2% chance over the last 20 years of ever granting a motion to dismiss on the theory that you're bringing it. Okay? You might at least advise your client that it's a low probability of success. You might want to change your strategy. You certainly would want to adjust how you argue it to the judge. Okay? So data analytics in the United States, to some extent in the UK and in Europe as well, are taking over how parties and counsel organize their case, create their strategies, and present them to judges. How much more important are data analytics for arbitrators if you get to choose them than for judges who you don't get to choose? And I think the answer is pretty obvious. It has to be more important. The problem to date, or the challenge to date, is how do you get the information while still preserving the confidentiality? And again, our sort of hack to this problem, our way of getting in between this problem, is the AIQ, which requests the information and data, but in a way that preserves the confidentiality. So let me tell you a little bit about where we are right now. So I will say it's really difficult to get people to fill out questionnaires. Every time I get off a plane from Delta, I get a nice little email. Would you please stop and fill out a questionnaire about how much you like your flight? And I hit delete quicker than anything else, right? I've never even contemplated filling out that questionnaire. And of course, that's quite similar when you have, or even worse, when you have really busy lawyers. Okay, we just finished one case and we're ready to move on to the next case. So our initial effort to break through that challenge is through arbitrator intelligence campaigns that we've run. And our first one was in Latin America. And the way we ran these campaigns is we sent out a request for what we called ambassadors, which is a gentle euphemism for volunteers we don't have any money to pay, but we're hoping will help us. And we had, in the course of a week that we had to call out, 100 ambassadors volunteer. You would think, okay, well, these are all students. No, we actually had the Deputy Attorney General of Ecuador, several partners in law firms, several individuals who also work for arbitral institutions in Latin America. So we have a pretty sophisticated set of ambassadors. We gave them some marching orders. Please talk to people about arbitrator intelligence. Explain it to them, because certainly they're not going to fill out an AIQ if they don't know what the project is about. And what the project is about, I will say, in your package you'll see we have a mission statement. So we have 3 objectives. One is increased transparency, making information more available to users. I don't want to confuse this kind of transparency with the transparency that's often talked about in investment arbitration, which is opening it up to the general public. Because this is not about opening commercial arbitration to the general public so much as making information about how commercial arbitration is conducted more available for the users. So transparency is one. Accountability is another. One of the problems, I think, with the arbitration, why everyone says, oh, the same people get appointed over and over and over again. I know there are some of you in that room who think that's a great thing, but it does have some negative consequences, right? Number one, the number of cases has expanded dramatically. There aren't, the pool of arbitrators needs to expand. The problem is if you don't have information about them, then you can't essentially determine who are the good ones to expand to. In other words, you can't have a viable meritocracy, okay, without some information that's readily available about these people in some means other than telephone calls. And that brings me to my third objective for arbitrator intelligence, and that is diversity. There are a lot of calls for diversity, a lot of efforts to appoint this person. I was at a conference where I was speaking. One person said, great idea. We should demand that every time a client receives a list of potential arbitrators, it has at least one woman on it. Sounds pretty good, right? The problem is if you have no information about that woman, you're never going to appoint her. And you can congratulate yourself for having put the name on the list, okay? And nothing is improved. And I'll give you this example that I use often, especially I started it with my Latin American campaign. Imagine we have a young woman arbitrator who has now had her first 3 appointments, youngish, okay? And she was brilliant. Both parties thought she was brilliant. The counsel for both parties thought she was brilliant. The institution loved her. And she's now sat in 3 arbitrations with these rave reviews. Okay? But how many people in the world know that? Maybe 30? And what's the likelihood that they're going to get one of those phone calls because no one knows to call them? Okay? We've seen some innovation. So, for example, we know that the ICC now posts the names of people who are sitting in cases on their website. That's really helpful. But if you don't know who has sat with that person, okay, or who has appeared before them, you still don't know who to call. Now, GAR, the ART tool, also provides some help in this regard because they have a listing of arbitrators who have sat with different arbitrators or who has appeared before them. But then again, you're limited to your telephone, and you may or may not be able to call people on that list. And if you can't call people on that list, or if people on that list aren't getting too many phone calls, it might not be a particularly valuable way to get the information you need. So through the campaign, we ended up, out of the 100 ambassadors who applied, we hired about 30. We thanked for their contributed time, about 30. They went out and they promoted and talked about arbitrator intelligence, and through that campaign, we were able to get a bunch of AIQs, which I'll tell you about in a minute. We just finished, actually, as of today, a Central and Eastern European campaign. Once again, we sent out a call for ambassadors, and we got an overwhelming response. And then our next target will be MENA and Turkey. And that's going to be run a little bit differently than the others, but you should watch for it. We are also, on March 8th, starting a women's campaign. I'll explain to you why we need, apart from just the generic concern about diversity, we specifically need more AIQs on women arbitrators for one of our next steps. Our MENA and Turkey campaign will be starting in May. After that, and one of the fun things for me at least, is that we've already been receiving a pretty regular stream of inquiries of people from Africa, Asia, and Western Europe, where we haven't started a campaign yet, saying, you know, wait a minute, can I be an ambassador too? And so we anticipate having some robust campaigns there. Now, why is that important to have a campaign? One, we just need the AIQs, and it's very difficult to get people to fill out a questionnaire. That's part of why we have the 2 phases, because phase 1 can be a junior person, even a paralegal, or a sophisticated legal secretary, just someone who knows how to read the award carefully. But the campaigns are also important because we want quality data. And the idea is that if people have sort of bought in because they've been approached and understand what arbitrator intelligence is about, they're more likely not just to complete an AIQ, but to complete it respectfully and carefully. In addition, just to give you a sense of where we came out, so we had 30 ambassadors from Latin America, 15 from the Central and Eastern European campaign. Here are 2 of our ambassadors that they had done so much to bring in AIQs, so much to publicize. They've done presentations. The other thing that they've done, I'll pause here, is we have cooperation agreements with arbitral institutions, again, to get quality AIQs. We don't just want random AIQs. And we have signed with about 7 institutions right now, including SEAC, including several in 6 or 7 in Latin America, and we're currently in discussions with several others to enter into these agreements. The cooperation agreements are pretty easy. The idea is that at the end you might see this if you sat in an arbitrator at SEAC, for example, the Singapore International Arbitration Center. They say actually when you're retained as an arbitrator that you will potentially have an AIQ filled out. And at the end of the arbitration, basically the institutions send out a couple of emails asking the parties and counsel to complete an AIQ about their experience in that arbitration. And in exchange for that, when our reports are ready, we will give them to institutions for free. The idea being that arbitral institutions have a critical need to be able to appoint quality arbitrators, and we believe our reports will help them be able to do that effectively. These two were just with me. We had our first rollout of the prototype in Vienna on Friday at Vienna Arbitration Days, and these have been so active, these two women have been so active in our campaign that they won a prize to come to the Vienna Arbitration Days, and they participated there. So with all this, how many AIQs, how many questionnaire responses have we collected to date? From our Latin American campaign, we had about 220 in total submitted. From the Central and Eastern European campaign, a much smaller region, and the campaign was only 3 weeks, we've collected, and I still am getting them today, but about 75 AIQ campaigns, AIQ responses. That brings us to roughly a total of over 700 AIQs total on more than 850 arbitrators. So because they're from Latin America and Eastern Europe, a number of our AIQ responses are from sole arbitrators sitting by themselves, or from some of the same arbitrators. So we see the pool of arbitrators we have information on expands, but not in direct correlation to the number of AIQs collected. So with these AIQ responses, what we're planning to do from now is to, first thing we're going to do is refine the prototype. So what you've seen are some very short video clips of the prototype. We're refining it and getting it ready to present in more detail and to send out to people so you can fill out feedback forms on the prototype itself. That chart doesn't make so much sense to me. It'd be much more important for me to see the data analyzed this way or presented this way. Okay? Or I don't understand how you came up with this quotient based on this question from the AIQ. That's again how we created the AIQ in the first place, was by getting a lot of feedback from in-house counsel in particular. We'll be refining the prototype so that it's kind of optimal. We will be rolling out a membership program. Again, the key here is to both get a lot of feedback responses and quality ones. So one of the ways we're going to do that is we're going to open up a membership program. The arbitrator intelligence reports will be for sale, as I said, through Cutler. And the big question is pricing. That's another question I always get. How expensive are these going to be? One of the things we don't want to do is be part of the problem of expensive arbitration. We're part of the solution. So we're looking at pricing. That's one of the things we'll be doing when we go around trying to refine the prototype, and we'll be asking people to whom I present, what do you think about pricing? Right now, what we're thinking about is a membership program that will invite our law firms or companies to give us retrospective AIQs on all the cases they've had over the last 2 years. Okay, and a promise to give us prospective AIQs subject to client objection on into the future. And the reason why that's important is, again, because then we can hope for, we have a higher expectation for quality responses rather than just random responses. In exchange for the membership, the idea is we'll give them some period of free reports when they come out. I'm guessing if you give us 2 years retrospective AIQs, we'll have to give you 2 years of free reports. Okay, and then lock in at some very minimal price. We're thinking maybe $500 per report per arbitrator. Okay. Some of the reports might be customizable in the future. For example, you say, okay, these are my 3 people on my short list. Can you compare how these 3, what their track records are on document production? What these 3, their track record is on interest rates, on bifurcation decisions? Okay, because those are really important issues to me in this case. But the membership program will make these reports available for some period of time and for a very discounted rate. Why? Because right now is when we need the data the most. There'll probably be tranches of the membership program. So if you get in early, you get a really great bargain. Okay, and if you can still decide to join a little later, watch and see what's going to happen. But if you decide a little later, there'll be a cost. It'll be a little more expensive per report. And the big challenge of a project like this, we all know from economics, right, is the free rider problem. Okay, everybody wants the reports. Nobody wants to fill out the AIQs, right? So the answer to that, we have an economist on my board of directors, an econometrist actually. He's the one helping us with developing our data analytics. And he's, as an economist would, he says, the way you make a free ride, you get rid of free riders is you just don't make the ride free. So if you don't give us AIQs and promise to give us AIQs, maybe it costs $10,000 a report, okay, or $20,000 a report. The idea, though, is that we believe this will be a really valuable resource, and that it should be something that everyone can afford, including smaller law firms in developing countries. We might have discounts or free reports, pro bono, something like that as well. I already mentioned we're entering into these cooperation agreements with institutions. I won't say the identity of the institutions we're in discussion with right now because we haven't actually signed with them, but I will say there's more than a dozen. I also think the idea for institutions that all they have to do is send out some emails at the end of their case and they get free reports is pretty appealing. We haven't even approached Western European institutions yet because we've been focusing on regional institutions, but we think that that will be something that more and more institutions will join up on. My understanding, for example, from more than one source is that the ICC, it was a huge innovation that they put on their website the names of arbitrators appearing in their cases. My understanding is the number one question they get in response to that is, what other information can you tell us about these cases? And their answer, because they're an institution, has to be no. We can't tell you anything else, because that's confidential. We, on the other hand, we get our information from the parties and counsel themselves, protected by confidentiality, so we don't have that restriction. We can give you that information about the arbitrator, separated from the case in a way that protects that confidentiality. So you might think of us, for example, as a giant information aggregator. Okay? We are a platform technology. We are an innovation in that respect. So we are not matching riders with drivers like Uber, or people who need a place to sleep with people who have an apartment they want to rent out like Airbnb. What we are doing is we are matching people who have information with people who need information. They happen to be the exact same groups, just at different times in the life of an arbitration process. Okay? What we'll be doing next, we're entering into more agreements. As I said, we'll be creating next, our next stage is to create sample reports based on real arbitrators. So this is a mock arbitrator based on totally fake data. And what we want to do is use that, as I said, to kind of refine what the prototype looks like, what the real report should look like. And then we will start doing reports on individual arbitrators that we have collected data on. So we have, I will tell you, one of the reasons we're doing the women's campaign, apart from the obvious reason, is that we have now sufficient data, not as many as 43, but we have a good chunk of data on a Latin American male arbitrator as a consequence of our Latin American campaign, but we don't have enough data on a female arbitrator, comparable amount of data on a female arbitrator. So we very much want AIQs filled out on women arbitrators so that we can have one of our initial sample reports. We can have one on a male arbitrator and one on a female arbitrator. Our next steps, we have a lot of them. It's actually quite a complicated process. We'll be working towards full automation. So that's what that means is essentially when the data comes in to through the AIQ, it'll actually be a computer program that sorts the data and controls for certain errors. There'll probably always be human intervention, but it'll be pretty narrow as it goes to full automation. So since I know I have a bunch of arbitrators in the room, I'm going to, before I close, talk a couple of other ways that we protect against the disgruntled losing party problem, or just more generally unreliable feedback. So first of all, we have a number of ways to check internally within our data for consistency, and we have some control questions that kind of send off signals if they're sort of answered incorrectly. We also are able to, when we're doing data analytics, and I think this is one sign of one indication of why data can be quite superior, for example, to phone calls. Let's say you have a case bifurcation is critically important to your client, and you've called around to 3, maybe 4 people who've had this arbitrator in a case of a bifurcation. And the person, in all 4 cases, actually was granted 3 out of the 4. You, oh, this person's perfect for us. Okay? As it turns out, those are 3 outliers. You can't know that because you have no idea when you call around randomly if those cases are representative or if they're unusual. Okay? You can't know if you get 4 or 5 document production feedback, whether those are typical or unusual. I showed you the timing data where even our very virtuous arbitrator, who always usually comes in under the average, on a couple of them took longer for whatever reason. Okay, what happens if those are the only phone calls or the only feedback you get by phone call? We think that the data it'll never fully displace the qualitative research that goes into it, the feedback that you get through the so-called grapevine by telephone. But we do think it will actually promote a more robust meritocracy. It'll increase the accuracy that people are looking for when they appoint arbitrators. It'll help catch international arbitration up with the kind of analytics that are everyday practice now in litigation in many parts of the world. We have bigger cases. We consider ourselves more sophisticated. It seems to me we now need to start using some of the tools that are available in other places. So I'm going to look off now, because I'm a professor, into the very distant future. Let's say all of our reports come out, they're wildly successful, everyone's using them. What might happen in the future? Well, I could imagine maybe arbitrator intelligence data could be a resource for research, not just academic research, which it will of course be. But let's say you're trying to argue to the tribunal what the interest rate should be in a particular context. In oil and gas case, I keep going to oil and gas, in a construction case in Bulgaria. Okay? Well, you could ask us for the data we have on interest rates in that region, in that industry, in cases of a particular value, in cases with other features. Okay? And you could say, we could become a resource, something that's cited, for example, to arbitral tribunals. The data, why? Because this isn't known otherwise. The reason why I keep coming back to interest rates is it's amazing to me that international arbitration moves trillions of dollars around the world, okay? But there's no agreed upon legal resource for what you look at, no agreed upon agreement on what source you look to determine the applicable interest rate. Okay? The source, let alone what the rate is, let alone whether it's simple or compounded. If it's compounded, how frequently it's compounded. Now, it is sort of amazing that our industry hasn't come to terms with that yet. Now, there's been some effort to do research. The City Bar of New York wants to do some research and has done some research, but the only thing they can look at are the cases that are published. The few cases that make it through New York courts. And that's a very tiny fraction of all the cases. Imagine having a very broad base of information on all the cases that are in international arbitration and being able to sort that data by various criteria. We also, I think, looking off into the distant future, or maybe not so distant, because some people have suggested that it should be closer than expected. So we keep hearing about, okay, well, maybe you can have redacted awards. We should redact the awards. There should be more redacted awards available. Well, one problem is redacting is very expensive. Number 2, you have to then read all the redacted awards. So that can be kind of cumbersome. But using our system of essentially extracting out with a cover of confidentiality the critical data out of awards, it may be in the future, and we haven't even approached this yet, that arbitral institutions, for example, might give us access to their awards for us to do an AIQ analysis on them. Now, if you had enough awards, for example, by having a body that, are the body of awards that are with all the arbitral institutions, you could start doing things like machine learning. So I mentioned to you some of the questions in our questionnaire in phase 2 are what methodology was used to interpret the contract or the statute or the treaty. Through machine learning, you could actually train a computer to be able to determine what words and phrases and grammar structures are typical of plain meaning analysis, okay, and which are more typical of other fairness and equity or business common sense, and therefore have much more like some of the technology that's being used in courts right now. You could have computers developing models for when different awards are using different types of analysis. And that could not just be useful for having a wider, a broader base of data, but also as a check, right? You have human beings saying, my perception is that the arbitrators used a flexible approach to contract interpretation, and our machine learning model says, no, it's actually a very literal plain meaning. And when you start trying to reconcile where the problem is, or where the divergence, or what accounts for that divergence, it could be kind of interesting. The other question, the other, I think, future, and I say this because, and maybe there's a question out here on this, almost every presentation I give, I literally get asked by arbitrators, can't you have an AIQ specially for arbitrators? And as I said, it's usually someone who would like to tell about some horrible arbitrator that they sat with, or the other really obvious point, which is arbitrators know much more about what happens in the arbitral proceedings, and therefore are in a much better situation to provide meaningful insights about other arbitrators than parties or counsel who have this sort of distance. I could imagine in some distant future that, for example, either with parties' consent, if both parties consent, that they sometimes do want to know something about what happened in the arbitration, or, for example, a very specialized, narrow questionnaire that avoids the issues of confidentiality, and so it doesn't ask case-specific, but maybe more generalized for more generalized feedback. One thing I think I didn't mention earlier, but I think is good to underline. So both because of data protection rules, protect ourselves against defamation claims, and out of just respect and fairness for arbitrators, we will not be publishing any reports for which arbitrators don't consent. Okay, we believe we are compliant with EU data protection in collecting the information, but we would not be able to legally publish or sell the reports. But we think that that's fine if some people don't want to consent, because we think that that will end up being a mark, sort of like a listing on the U.S. Stock Exchange. Companies that list on the U.S. Stock Exchange tend to have higher IPOs, and there are two academic theories for why. One is that companies are willing to pay a higher price when there's more information, and U.S. disclosure requirements require a lot of disclosure. And the second theory is that U.S. Securities fraud is pretty onerous, and if you're willing to say, I'm not afraid of U.S. securities fraud laws, that investors have greater confidence in you. It's a signaling mechanism to the market. Well, we think that arbitrator intelligence might be something similar for arbitrators, and that we could imagine some growth in this area once people get accustomed to this kind of data collection. So that's what I have for you. There are, I hope, some questions. Yes? So, pardon?
Would you consider including when arbitrators refuse their reports to be published?
Yeah, so one of the things we're working on is developing what we think are responsible, respectable editorial policies. We do think that it would be absent some identifiable reason why, like an AIQ where they say, look, I never sat, in that legal seat on that date, so it couldn't possibly be accurate that they put my name down. We'll have, mechanisms for screening those out, also for, truly hostile or unfair ones. But I think that actually, absent those kind of criteria, it is fair to say and consistent with law to say this arbitrator has opted not to have a report available, and parties can draw from that what they want.
Yeah, this will allow us to raise.
Yeah, I mean, and I want to say there could be lots of reasons. One of the things that we will be doing with both reports, and I think when we make them available, is lots of disclaimers, right? Data has limitations as well. It can have some incredible insights that you don't get anecdotally or qualitatively. It can also have some anomalies, and we don't, some of the problems you have with anecdotal collection we have as well, or we could have, selection bias. Everyone was afraid, actually, when we started this, that it's going to be the parties that are upset with arbitration that go and fill these out. We've had actually the opposite, at least I haven't checked the final results on the Latin American AIQs that we've collected, but about halfway through, when we looked, 85% of respondents either got an award that was more favorable or as favorable of what they were expecting. Now, that's not random. It's because we have these ambassadors, right, who are going out and saying, please fill out an AIQ. So you're imagining people are willing at that point to support our mission statement, our sort of arbitration-friendly people. But that's part of the design of why we have these campaigns. And so right now we think that our data is a little bit skewed towards arbitration-friendly responders, which is not a bad thing, right? I think they might be more accurate than people who are disgruntled, right? But that's also something we'll be watching to adjust for. And I can't do it, but my econometrist colleague, you can screen for through multiple regression analysis for anomalies that come up in the response rates. Yes?
I was just wondering, as I recall, a few years ago in Florida, you told a story about talking to an arbitrator who told you a story of another arbitrator behaving very unethically. Now, obviously, you went on this.
Yes.
But I just was wondering, years on, is there any way, you're talking about the problem of disgruntled parties and hostile parties, but what about when they have a reason to be hostile? And we raise this problem of, people just don't get that information because of the confidentiality and this person kept on getting appointed.
Yeah.
So do you envision any way of dealing with that problem in the future?
So that is a hard one, because what we want to do is obviously create transparency. There are limits, including, I think, most expressly arbitrator consent. So we do have some open text questions where you can kind of write out something. We would do probably what IMI does and some other, like the Judicial Almanac in the United States. We would wait until we have a collective of feedback that's consistent to kind of show representational feedback that we've received that's not just checking a box. With regard to true misbehavior, at least at this point, given the limitations with consent and also potentially defamation, we probably won't be making that available. The story, if anyone was wondering, and I'm going to anonymize it even more because it was kind of London, it wasn't London-based misconduct, but it was told to me in London. The two very, very senior arbitrators told me a story of another arbitrator they swore was in the top 10 worldwide, okay? I don't know if that was actually true, but it was someone who was quite prestigious. They didn't tell me his name was part of why it was a he, but they didn't tell me. But who did, I would say, conduct that was, if not toes over the line into criminality, pretty darn close. Really pretty, repugnant behavior. Exploiting what was a very senior position in a, established name. And I said, that's incredible. I was just sort of, because I study ethics and arbitrator ethics. I was like, oh my gosh, that's unbelievable. How does this person keep getting appointed? And with just zero credulity, they looked at me and said, well, because nobody knows. And my response was, well, that's not true. You two know, okay? And some other people know. The problem is it's a very small circle of people who know, and the vast majority of people don't know. And that's part of what inspires this project, even if we're not going to be able, anytime in the near future, to be able to zero in on that kind of misconduct. But we think that, one of the things that I'm seeing, again, I wrote my article 12 years ago. Back then, I had law firms tell me to my face, actually one person at a law firm, we hope your project fails, because this is the information we sell to our clients, and we don't want the competition. Okay? Some of those same big law firms are the ones who invited me to speak at Vienna Arbitration Days, who are inviting me now for in-house presentations on this because they realize their clients want this information. Okay? And all it takes, if you're a large law firm, is one instance where you swore this was based on your inside information, okay, all your phone research, this was the perfect arbitrator for your client's case, and then something goes wrong, and that arbitrator joins the majority, and it's not a good outcome. And then you have to go to your client and explain how that happened, okay? And based on the 4 phone calls you had, it didn't seem like it should happen, okay? And the other reason why in-house counsel like it is because that in-house attorney you told that to, well, I'm sorry, this didn't work out, has to go to their board. And their board they have to explain to their board how a several million-dollar loss, okay, was based on what's essentially, not to denigrate it, because I understand where it comes from and it's still going to be important, but what's essentially glorified gossip, okay? Because why the sales manager who comes in behind them and has to explain why his department or her department lost several million dollars has all sorts of charts and graphs to make it clear, to justify, okay, the downturn in the economy or the such and such, right? So in-house counsel really like this, which I think is part of why law firms have stop saying that, at least to my face. I know some still say it behind my back. And to them I say this: you will always have information to add at the margins. You will always have something more to add, and in fact at the margin it might even be more valuable. Okay? But I do think the era of relying on that solely has passed. And when I first started, arbitrators also told me, oh, you can't do this to arbitrators, we can't be evaluated. It's like, well, everything these days is evaluated. Of course you can. What you can hope for is that it's responsible, respectful evaluation, okay, that is meant to, again, promote a robust meritocracy as opposed to something that's open and loose and can be abused. So I see another question who has the microphone in the back, and then I'll come back. Did I see your hand? Oh, no, okay, sorry. Yes?
Hi. Works. Yes, it works. So I have two questions. First is, so it works to both commercial and investment arbitration, right? And my second question would be, I have a really big problem with this project,
Okay.
to be honest. And my concern is the negative adverse effect of this project on the development of law, of arbitration law, in two areas. In areas of relaxing certain criteria by arbitrator, I will explain.
Okay.
Relaxing certain criteria in, like, with respect to certain issues. And the second one, taking a stance by arbitrators with respect to controversial issues in law, which is not as justified. So with respect to the first one, we have like criteria for bifurcation. We have criteria for ordering the disclosure of documents production, for accepting amicus curiae, etc. And because arbitrators know that this may go then to the questionnaire in your project, they would be inclined to get some benefits with respect or in comparison with other arbitrators, inclined to take the more relaxed stance on those issues. And for example, in investment arbitration, we have these controversial issues of application of MFN clauses to dispute resolution clauses and interpretation of umbrella clauses. And because of, again, your project, they might say unjustifiably that they will take like approach which is more favorable to the parties because, well, definitely they want to be chosen as a party. So I'm not saying that this project like will bring in arbitration law to very bad circumstances, but, and you might answer that councils already do that, parties already do that, but I think that your project will act as an accelerator of this process.
So I understand the concern, but I think part of it is addressed or would be mitigated if you looked at the questionnaire. I think you're imagining a lot of questions that are in the questionnaire that just aren't there. And more importantly, I think, the questionnaire, and this is what we've spent so much time working hard on, is it doesn't have, we tried really hard to knock out any cultural bias into, you know, one outcome, like lots of documents are better than fewer documents. The questions were written to be very neutral. And I think that's right, because in some cases, your client wants a lot of document production, and in other cases, your client has all the dirty documents. It could still be an American client, it could be an American law firm, and you don't want document production. So the questionnaire itself is agnostic about the answers. With regard to your concern about the substance in investment law, we ask very minimalistic, if we ever get to machine learning, that might be a different issue. But if you're concerned about investment law and the substantive analysis of investment law creating sort of a vicious or a particular cycle, you should be much more concerned about all the empirical work that's being done on investment law because the awards are public. We ask some, what I have to admit, are pretty crude questions about the substance. We don't even ask what the nature of the contract was. We ask the industry. But we ask, contract interpretation, kind of whether it was plain meaning, relied on precedent, relied on legislative history or drafting history. Okay, but that's a pretty blunt instrument. And again, depending on where you're from or what your client's interests are in a particular case, you either like the fact that they're going to rely on legislative history or negotiation history, or you don't. But we don't believe, I understand your concern with investment substance on like MFN, we don't have any of that in the questionnaire. And again, I think that because parties are looking for different things, it doesn't have a particular, it's not going to accelerate one way or the other, unless in the industry everyone, somehow it becomes, you know, the mode that everybody wants bifurcation. It might have some, but it's not, you're not going to be able to, I think, game it as an arbitrator, because half the parties want the opposite of what we're asking. Yeah?
Well, it's a slightly related question. That's statistical. Take document production. As I understand it, the way you set it up, you automate it ultimately, and it will kick out data. So you pitch the arbitration, kicks out data. How do you deal with the problem with that statistic bus? So if you have someone who's, say, done 35 arbitrations, 20 of which are in an area where classically document production is rare, and then another person who's done 500, where how do you deal with that particular issue? That seems to be quite fundamental to those comparisons. If you can't go and just take it a bit further, obviously when it's done in relation to court cases, you go and look up and you say, well, this is, for example, in the UK, we never get document production in patent cases, so it's the patent judge that's with the document production, you can talk about that one. Does it come do that here?
Yeah, so one obvious point from your observation is that our accuracy is going to grow as we have more data, which is part of why we're so data hungry right now, and we're trying to get as much as possible. I will, as a footnote, say in our, I guess you could call it market research, people have said to us, even if you have only one AIQ, we want it. Because it's kind of roughly equivalent to one phone call. Not exactly, and we will have to redact, I think, more to make sure that it's not identified. We don't think the case is particularly identifiable, but we might have more confidentiality concerns. It won't look like these reports, but we might make even a couple of feedbacks, without the analytics available. With regard to, so one of the, and this is one of the questions that we're going to be trying to research as we do focus groups on the prototype. And I think there might be, one of the answers might be a sort of order form for parties. Okay, I don't want my baseline of arbitrators, or I don't want to see all the AIQs this person has on document production. I only want to see it in construction cases, okay, that are seated in the UK, or that are seated in, so a little overstatement, almost any of the questions in our questionnaire could be a filter that eventually we hope to make parties be able to choose, and we'll probably have some baseline starting points. Another baseline that could be interesting is just the other arbitrators. So you have a short list of 3 or 5 arbitrators, and you have your 4 critical issues in the case: document production, interim relief, award of costs. How do these 3 arbitrators compare on those 3 metrics? Like, that would be really interesting, and then you don't have quite the problem of what the average is. And my sense of, if I'm talking to people, is that might be something that's very appealing. The other thing I keep talking about, selecting arbitrators. One of the ways this will be most important, I think, would be the other side of point, some arbitrator who your network can't find anything on. Okay? How do you get quick information that's relatively reliable about the opposing party's party-appointed arbitrator, or the chairperson of the institution's appointed, who you've never heard of? Okay? Those can be very important as well. In addition, this might be part of what you were thinking about as well, there's something called panel effects. So when different people sit together, or different constellations of qualities on a particular panel can change the way panels operate. Think about that. I mean, if you had enough data, we could start doing those kind of analytics. It could be very useful, and in constructing your panel to see. Because right now we do something similar to that. Okay, they appointed an engineering expert, a little arbitrator on that side. Does that mean we want a French law expert, or would it be better? Okay, so people do that, but it's kind of like holding your finger out to the wind. Wouldn't it be nice if you had some concrete data to be able to do that? There will always be limitations on our data, but the more data we have, the more nuanced our analysis will be able to be. And part of that will be, I think, creating options for parties to choose how they want it analyzed. So, yes.
I've noticed that you have very much focused on institutions. Spoken about. So you've focused very much on institutions, and data is coming from institutions, cooperation agreements with institutions. I'm very supportive of institutions. I'm a former registrar of the LCIA. But here at this seat in London, the vast majority of international commercial arbitrations are outside institutions. Indeed, in my day at the LCA, its biggest users were its biggest skeptics, because those law firms mainly dealt with ad hoc arbitration. So my question is, at this seat, which we are told by the Queen Mary survey is the world's most popular seat.
I don't do that survey. It is not related to this project.
I'm just pointing out that at this particular seat in London, we have a lot of arbitrations, and it's a popular seat. But more than 90% of those arbitrations are outside the institutions. And they come, in many cases, from diverse arbitration communities, centered around different sectors, centered around different specialisms. What efforts is arbitrary intelligence making, or is it planning to make, to win the trust of those diverse communities with diverse arbitrators in them? Trust which many of those communities don't have in the institutions.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to hear what you're going to do to reach out to them.
Well, so first of all, we do have, one of our questions on the questionnaire is obviously, was there an institution? And if not, whether it was ad hoc, and then separately, what rules govern, what arbitral rules govern. So it's not at all adverse to ad hoc arbitration. And the institutions are sort of an easy place to go to get some feedback. But we would, I guess our primary answer right now is ambassadors who reach out, to try and make direct relation, because one of the challenges when you don't ask the parties' names is you don't know when the arbitration's ended. Okay, so the reason we go to the institutions and say when the arbitration's over, will you send out some emails, is because they know when the arbitration's ended. The other reason we do these campaigns is because our ambassadors don't know when an arbitration's happening, but they can ask their friends, have you had one recently? Would you fill it out? So what I would say that probably the primary way we would hope when we bring our campaigns to England, that there would be someone who, or more than one, who is involved in those communities, will be an ambassador for us, and who will encourage those communities. And I guess the other way is talks like this. I would think actually for communities that are resistant to institutions, so they don't have some of that institutional support, dynamic data analytics might be particularly valuable. So, to some extent, I guess it's a matter of proving to them or demonstrating to them how useful this kind of data can be. But we're by no means, hostile to them. It's a little bit easier to kind of access institutional arbitrations. But in fact, actually, I think you're right that the ad hoc number is both huge and unknowable. And information about ad hoc arbitrators is even harder to find, right, than the institutional ones, because there's a sort of a grapevine through institutional arbitrations that doesn't really happen as much with ad hoc arbitration, except in certain sectors, perhaps. So I think the answer is actually the opposite, which is data might be particularly useful to provide some structure and reliability to free-floating, more ad hoc arbitration. Yes, and then yes. You have the...
Well, thank you for a very seductive account of a very interesting project, and I fully accept that in many contexts knowledge is always a good, more knowledge, and in the context of arbitration where people do select arbitrators who received praise, it's attractive to argue that they should be better informed about this, and if they'll certainly feel obliged once the tool is available, if only for self-defense, as you mentioned. But I just wanted to analyze the underlying purposes. In relation to diversity and in relation to efficiency, you emphasized objectively commendable purposes. So I agree with you that group decision-making can be markedly improved when decisional bodies have a diverse composition, as you said in the handout. But in relation to in other contexts, isn't there initially, at any rate, going to be, this is going to be used to try to skew results. In a constructionist, an issue of interpretation, you will go for, at least if you have access to your artificial intelligence information, you'll go for a strict constructionist if that favours you. If a purposive or teleological construction favours you, you'll go for the opposite. So initially, if one party has this, it will skew the result, or hopefully, unless the other party is in some way wise enough to suss the game out. The logic of it is, therefore, that both parties ought to inform themselves of join your artificial intelligence project and make advantage of it, in which case, presumably, the two efforts on each side will cancel each other out and lead to a position in the middle. I suppose you would argue that's wonderful. That's thesis and antithesis leading to a brilliant, fair synthesis in the moment, in the middle. But it does arrive there at a huge cost and a huge effort. So we are developing a parallel system of not litigation, but certainly a resolution of a significant preliminary issue. Now, I accept, as I said at the outset, that it happens to a degree in arbitration at the moment. We've never gone, of course, the jury vetting route in this country in criminal context, unlike the States. But I'd like your comments on those points.
Okay, well, first of all, those are really great questions and concerns. If you don't know, my area of specialty as a scholar is ethics. I spend a lot of time on arbitrator ethics, and in particular the constitution of the tribunal. So I said that part of this was about concerns about the market for arbitrator services. I didn't fully flesh that out. So you're right that, certainly if one party has this tool and the other side doesn't. The difference, though, is one of my big concerns, and in the article I first mentioned, is that the profound information asymmetries mean that at the time, and let's take the example of calling someone, right? And he's a good friend of mine and my former co-chair, so not for any particular reason except that everyone knows him and respects him, Rusty Park, okay? So let's say people are trying to know that Rusty Park knows the arbitrator that they're trying to appoint, okay? And a party from a multinational law firm based here in London calls Rusty, and by the way, they've probably appointed him in the past, maybe they belong to the same club, he knows them personally, okay? He's going to give a pretty detailed answer about this arbitrator, and that counsel then, and therefore their client, will have a lot of really robust information about that arbitrator. Now, some attorney from the largest law firm in Peru somehow finds out that Rusty knows this person, cold calls Rusty. Rusty is such a polite person, of course he'd probably respond, but you can imagine the kind of information you're going to give to someone you've never met before is going to be much more restricted. So my concern, in part creating this project, is you could have opposing sides in the same case, call the same person, ask them the same questions about the same arbitrator, and get two different answers, one of which would be really robust and one of which would be really low. At a minimum, what this does is it at least gives an equal opportunity to both to have a floor. I mean, there'll always be a different ceiling to the well-heeled party, but this, I think, creates an equal floor. I think the deeper part of your question is, okay, we accept that parties already kind of play games when they're trying to appoint an arbitrator, and shouldn't we just, think, wouldn't it be better if just no one played games? So shouldn't you create a technology that would prevent people from playing games rather than helping them play these games? I haven't figured out what that technology is yet, on the one hand, and I'm actually working on an article right now because I actually think the party-appointed arbitrator is really important, and is something to be celebrated, not just defended embarrassedly. I think parties engage in careful analysis of who they want to represent them because they have a particular view of what the case is. And they're looking for an arbitrator who will see the case the same way. And I think the best way to ensure, as you put better than I ever could, the best way to ensure impartiality on the tribunal is that each party has the same opportunity to pick someone who truly represents the way they see the case, okay, and has equal information about who that chairperson might be. So I see information and technology as a great equalizer in a system right now that I think has too many inequalities, and we see, and that's part of what's driving, I think, the frustration with diversity, or lack of diversity, which is it's creating unfair opportunities for the litigants. It's not just about representation and making a pool of arbitrators who looks right, okay? It's about fairness to the litigants. So I believe that this will be a tremendous strides on exactly those concerns.
Can I ask a very quick follow-up?
Absolutely. It's such a good question, you can ask two more.
On a different point, you said that arbitrators would be asked to consent. Will they see the underlying data?
Of course. Okay, how could you consent if you didn't see it? Yeah, so I think the harder question is this, and I will tell you, we haven't figured this out yet. We're still getting legal advice on this, but the question is, how frequently do they have to be able to see the results? I don't think they can see every single one that comes in. Is an annual update sufficient? Do they, so in other words, could you consent in perspective, number one? Number two, what are the policies for allowing them to challenge what they think are inappropriate reports?
There's a whole new area of
So, and again, the good news is, and this is the other sort of plug I will say, is, I come to this as someone who I think studies and understands the international arbitration community very well, has tremendous respect for all the players. But I don't have a foot in any, I don't serve as an arbitrator very intentionally because of this project. I have only on a few occasions, despite requests, served as an expert because I don't, again, want to insinuate myself in the process. There are very few disinterested parties, disinterested enough to be independent, who are also knowledgeable enough about the field to do something like this. And so that's, I think, part of the answer as well in terms of you're concerned about the reliability of the project. And I'm an academic, so I do this because I find it fascinating. So yes, and then I guess yes.
My question is, we've talked a lot about taking data from awards. Are you going to collect data from other sources? And I ask that because when we do diligence, often, particularly if you're looking for an arbitrator that isn't somebody that's been often appointed, which happens a lot when you're looking for a president, because people don't want to appoint somebody who's been appointed by other parties, and we'll start to filter up what they've written about, maybe what they did when they were in practice before they became an arbitrator. So will you be drawing from sources like that? And if so, how will you pull that kind of data together?
So I also should have started, we are kind of a little bit of we're like a startup. I like to joke that we exist on a shoestring budget, but that would assume we have shoes and string. So most of the finance for this come out of my personal bank account. But we're hoping as we scale up, for example, that some of these things will be able to be taken into account. It needs bodies to do that kind of research. The good news, though, is that Cutler, with whom we anticipate partnering, is in the process of creating their new tool, arbitrator tool. They are collecting not only all this biographical information, but they're linking it with live links to all the resources they have in their database. The other thing we've been looking at, because one of the people on my board of directors is a super interesting IST, information systems, this computer science guy, and he designs search engines and web crawls. And so one of the things we've been thinking about is something called a web crawl. I don't know if you know what that is. It's the way I describe it, that joke about if you put 100 monkeys in a room for 100 years, they come up with the works of Shakespeare. Okay, it's sort of like if you put 100 interns in a room for 100 years searching Google, they would come up with this kind of information because Google searches, and this is really me translating something I don't know very much about, but it's been explained to me this way, searches at a very superficial level, but very broad. Okay, but if some arbitrator, for example, you want to look at, and you want to know if they sat on the board of directors of a company, it doesn't come up until page 732 of the Google search, if at all, okay, because Google doesn't search that deeply. A web crawl would be able to do that. And for example, if you know Google Scholar, it does something similar. So there are sort of, that technology is out there. He's created a competitor to Google Scholar, and so he specializes in search engines and websites, and web crawls. And so we're thinking that a web crawl could be a very useful, also efficient, making it much more time efficient to do the kind of Google searching that people do right now. So, yes?
Are you collecting information on challenges?
On challenges? So that's an interesting one too. So we collect information at based on an outcome, a final outcome. So we ask in the questionnaire whether there was a challenge and whether any of the arbitrators are replacement arbitrators. Because, for example, if they came in, unusually, but after all the hearings, just before the award's written, you don't want to attribute to them, for example, any of the document production decision making, right? So we ask that question. We also ask if there were any challenges that were raised to the arbitrators who were at the end, and whether it came from a disclosure they made or information independently found by the parties. We do not ask what the nature of the challenge was, okay? Because it would raise all sorts of, it's an invitation for problems. But we do ask that question generally. You could imagine technology solving and helping some of these conflict of interest issues in the future as well, but that's not where we are right now.
So not for grounds,
we don't ask that information. Again, because we do ask again if it's a replacement arbitrator. We don't ask who the original arbitrator was though, who was removed or disclosed, so we have limited information on that. For strategic, for reasons that we just don't want to get sued for defamation because one side's great challenges, another side's strategic, abuse. Yeah. Did you have another question?
Yeah. Since you mentioned ethics, I want to know your personal opinion on the question. How do you think, your opinion as a lawyer, whether arbitrators should be chosen for the decisions they take or for qualifications they have?
recall? I mean, decisions that they have made in the past, or decisions they're anticipated to make? You know, again, I think part of the nature of party appointment is that parties should be able to choose that. It's because I'm not moralistic about party appointment. I don't have this idea that, you know, there's a righteous way to appoint a party-appointed arbitrator. I spend my whole life thinking about and writing about ethics, but I think, you know, ethics, you know, we bind decisions by parameters around which they'd be unethical, but I don't think ethics necessarily takes a moralistic idea about how to appoint people to, you must do this or you shouldn't do that. You put out the outer boundaries. And I actually think that you know, so an article I'm working on right now, again, I think celebrates the strategic decision-making in appointing your party-appointed arbitrator. And that is, I think it's really important to have an party-appointed arbitrator you believe in. A, because it does increase the likelihood of automatic compliance with or voluntary compliance with the outcome. And two, I think that the concern I have about tribunals is not that arbitrators are too skewed one way or the other on the two sides. It's that you have a very insular community, and there's a very real phenomenon called groupthink. And the preconditions for groupthink are a very homogeneous community that's seeking consensus. And even though we think we have this wide range of views in for example, investment arbitration, in fact, from Albert Jan Vandenberg's study, now like 5 years ago, he says, 100%, almost 100% of arbitrators, party-appointed arbitrators dissent in favor of the party who appointed them. True. But what percentage of party-appointed arbitrators do you think dissent? This is shocking. We would think, if what parties do is they pick the arbitrator they think is going to definitely rule in their favor, we would expect 100% dissents, right? Because every time the appointing party is going to lose, that arbitrator who has been appointed by them is going to dissent. In Albert Jan's study, it was 22%.
It's just because they didn't have your arbitration intelligence.
Maybe.
We'll see what will happen.
So I will say this, because you're obviously very concerned, and I haven't satisfied you yet. One thing I will say is, again, we're academics and we're researchers. I have a tremendous respect not only for arbitrators, but also for the system. We'll be monitoring to make sure we're not creating problems that we're trying to solve them. That's something that's important to me, and I'm not sure I totally know. I'm not as skeptical as you, but I don't know all the problems that might come up, but we'll be watching for them. Yes?
I was going to interrupt, actually.
Oh, okay, sorry. You got preemptive, I'll come right back.
So the interruption is,
Yeah.
I think we need to
Stop
and thank Professor Rogers.
Okay.
And I think the discussion can keep going more informally, and we'll bring some drinks out. But I didn't mean to cut off your question. You jumped in as I started to say thank you to Catherine, and I wanted everyone to give her a round of applause for a very interesting introduction. And I do think we have got drinks coming around for those of you who want to stay and keep talking.